August 15, 1945. The day Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled through radio speakers across Japan, announcing the unthinkable surrender. In a small prisoner of war facility outside Phoenix, Arizona, that same announcement would arrive 6 days later, carried by Captain Evelyn Hartwell as she walked across the sun-baked compound toward the barracks housing 43 Japanese women. The August heat shimmered off the desert floor, but inside the main assembly hall, the air felt frozen with anticipation. Masako Ishida stood among her fellow prisoners, her posture rigid despite the exhaustion that had settled into her bones over the past 6 months. At 23 years old, she had served as a communication specialist for the Imperial Japanese Army, intercepting and translating enemy radio transmissions until her unit was captured in the Philippines. Now she waited with the others, uncertain what this emergency assembly would mean for their futures. Captain Hartwell entered the hall with an expression that Masako had learned to read over the months. Not the stern military mask she wore during inspections, but something softer, almost concerned. Behind her came Sergeant Raymond Nakano, the Japanese-American translator whose presence had been both comforting and confusing to the prisoners. How could someone of Japanese blood serve America so loyally? It was a question that had haunted Masako since their first conversation. The captain's words, translated carefully by Sergeant Nakano, should have brought relief. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. Arrangements were being made for their repatriation. They would be processed through displaced persons camps and eventually return to their homeland. Freedom, home, family. These were words that should have sparked joy or at least hope. Instead, Masako felt something twist uncomfortably in her chest. She glanced sideways at Teruko Saito, the 26-year-old medical assistant who had become her closest friend in captivity. Teruko's face showed the same conflicted emotions that Masako felt churning inside. On Masako's other side stood Hanai Ono, barely 20 years old, whose family in Hiroshima had sent no word for months. The younger woman's hands trembled slightly as she processed the announcement. What Captain Hartwell described as freedom felt more complicated than simple release. Return to what Japan, the country they had left 6 months ago, no longer existed. News had filtered through during their imprisonment. Cities bombed beyond recognition. 2 unimaginable weapons that had devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki in a single blinding flash. A homeland that had told them they were serving with honor, only for them to discover they had been defending something far darker than they had ever imagined. But more than that, something had happened to them here in this Arizona desert that none of them could have predicted. Something that made the prospect of leaving feel less like liberation and more like abandonment. It had started with small gestures of unexpected kindness. It had grown through shared work and halting conversations, and it had crystallized around the most unlikely symbol imaginable, a frozen dessert served in a glass dish that they had never seen before, arriving in America. Ice cream sundaes, February 9, 1945. The transport truck rumbled through the Arizona desert under a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Masako pressed her face against the canvas covering, catching glimpses of an alien landscape that bore no resemblance to the lush valleys of Nagasaki where she had grown up. Everything here was brown and endless, dotted with strange spiny plants that looked like they were designed to repel human touch. The 43 women crowded into the truck bed had been traveling for 3 days since their arrival in San Francisco. They wore the remnants of their service uniforms, now stained and worn from weeks of transit through military processing centers. Some still bore the insignia of the Imperial Japanese Women's Auxiliary Corps, though American guards had removed anything that might be considered a weapon, including the small ceremonial pins many had carried. Masako clutched at a leather-bound notebook that contained her only remaining connection to her former life. Inside were radio codes, personal observations, and brief diary entries written in careful Japanese characters. The American soldiers who had processed her belongings had flipped through it, found nothing that appeared to be intelligence value, and returned it with a shrug. They had no idea it contained her entire identity. Beside her, Teruko Saito sat with the practiced stillness of someone trained in medical emergencies. The older woman's face showed no emotion, but Masako had noticed how her hands periodically checked the small first aid kit she had been allowed to keep. Old habits died hard. Even in captivity, Teruko's instinct was to prepare for injuries she might need to treat. Hanae Ono, the youngest among them, had cried silently for the first 2 days of the journey. Now her tears had dried, leaving only a hollow expression that made her look far older than her 20 years. She had received one letter from home before their capture, mentioning that her younger brother had been conscripted. Since then, silence. The not knowing seemed worse than any confirmed tragedy. The truck finally slowed, turning off the main road onto a dirt path that led to a collection of low buildings surrounded by wire fencing. It was not the imposing fortress Masako had imagined. The compound looked almost temporary, as if it had been constructed hastily to serve an unexpected need. A wooden sign near the entrance read, "Fort Huachuca Auxiliary Facility," though Masako could not read the English letters. As the truck stopped and the canvas was pulled back, harsh sunlight flooded in. An American woman in military uniform stood waiting, flanked by several male guards. Captain Evelyn Hartwell, though Masako would not learn her name until later, surveyed the arriving prisoners with an expression that seemed more appraising than hostile. She said something in English that Masako could not understand. Then a male voice translated in careful, formal Japanese. The speaker was Sergeant Raymond Nakano, whose Japanese features created immediate confusion among the prisoners. "Welcome to Arizona," he said. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Follow all instructions and you will not be harmed." The first 3 weeks passed in rigid routine that felt both familiar and alien to Masako and the other prisoners. Morning assembly at dawn, when the desert air still held a chill that made the women shiver in their thin clothing. Breakfast of unfamiliar American food, bland and colorless compared to the rice and vegetables they had known. Work assignments that rotated daily, cleaning duties, kitchen assistance, laundry detail. Evening assembly and return to barracks as the sun set in spectacular displays of orange and purple that seemed wasted on their circumstances. The women maintained the military discipline they had learned in their service. They stood at attention when American officers entered a room. They bowed reflexively, even though the gesture seemed to confuse their captors. They spoke only in hushed Japanese during meals, discussing nothing of importance, aware that Sergeant Nakano might be listening and understanding every word. Masako noticed how the other women watched her, looking for leadership she was not sure she could provide. She had been an officer in training, responsible for a small communications unit. That experience, combined with her relative fluency in English compared to the others, had made her an unofficial spokesperson. It was a role she had never wanted and certainly had not expected to carry into captivity. Captain Hartwell observed them with an intensity that Masako found unnerving. The American commander was not cruel, but she was constantly present, watching how the prisoners interacted with each other and with the guards. She took notes in a small book, recording observations that Masako desperately wished she could read. What did the Americans see when they looked at them? Enemies? Curiosities? Simply another administrative problem to be managed until the war ended? The guards maintained professional distance, following protocols that kept interaction to a minimum. Private Lester Drummond, a lanky young man who looked barely old enough to shave, was assigned to their barracks section. He had a farmer's hands, rough and calloused, and a way of moving that suggested he was more comfortable with animals than people. He never spoke to the prisoners beyond basic instructions, but Masako noticed how his eyes lingered sometimes, not with hostility, but with what looked like confusion, as if he could not reconcile their presence with whatever he had been told about Japanese enemies. Teruko had established herself in the small medical station, assisting an American Army doctor who seemed grateful for her competent help despite the language barrier. Medicine, it turned out, had its own universal language of symptoms and treatments. Hanai worked in the administrative office, filing papers she could not read, but organizing with the meticulous attention to detail that had made her valuable in her previous assignment. At night, lying on narrow cots in the barracks, some women cried quietly. Others prayed to gods they were no longer sure were listening. Masako wrote in her notebook, documenting everything she observed, though she no longer knew why. Who would ever read these observations? What purpose did recording their captivity serve except to pass the endless hours before sleep finally came? March arrived with temperatures that climbed steadily as the days progressed. The Arizona desert heat was unlike anything the women had experienced. Japan had humid summers that made clothing stick to skin, but this was different. This was a dry, relentless heat that seemed to pull moisture from the body, leaving lips cracked and throats perpetually parched. The barracks, constructed of thin wood and metal, became ovens by mid-afternoon. The women learned to move slowly during work assignments, conserving energy and seeking any patch of shade. But shade was scarce, and the water rations, while adequate, felt insufficient for the conditions. Private Lester Drummond had grown up on a cattle ranch in the White Mountains of eastern Arizona. He understood desert survival in ways that the military doctors and officers from back east did not. He noticed things. How some of the Japanese women had stopped sweating, a dangerous sign of heat exhaustion. How they worked through obvious discomfort without complaint, maintaining the rigid discipline that seemed bred into them. How the youngest one, Hane, had developed a persistent cough that grew worse as the dry air irritated her lungs. It was not officially part of his duties to care about such things. He was supposed to maintain security, ensure compliance with camp regulations, and report any unusual behavior. But his grandmother, who had raised him after his parents died in a farming accident, had taught him something that the military had not. "You don't let anything suffer if you can prevent it," she had said. "Animal or person makes no difference. Suffering you can prevent and don't is suffering you caused." On a particularly brutal afternoon in mid-March, Drummond made a decision that would later seem more significant than he intended at the time. He filled a metal bucket with water from the pump, added chunks of ice from the kitchen's small ice box, and carried it to the work area where a group of prisoners were hanging laundry. The women looked at him with immediate suspicion as he approached. Masako stepped forward, positioning herself between him and the others, her body language protective despite her smaller stature. Drummond set down the bucket and pointed to it, then to them, then mimed drinking. The women exchanged glances. Was this a test? A trick? They had been warned about American cruelty, though so far they had experienced mostly indifference. Drummond pulled out a metal cup from his belt, dipped it into the ice water, and drank deeply himself, showing them it was safe. Then he offered the cup to Masako. She hesitated for a long moment before accepting. The water was so cold it made her teeth ache. She had not realized such coldness was possible in liquid form. Ice was something she associated with winter, not something deliberately added to drinking water. The sensation was shocking and wonderful simultaneously. She drank carefully, then passed the cup to Teruko, who did the same. Within minutes, all the women had gathered around the bucket, taking turns with the cup, speaking in rapid Japanese. Sergeant Raymond Nakano had not wanted this assignment. Being Japanese-American in the military meant constantly proving loyalty that white soldiers never had to demonstrate. He had been born in Sacramento, had never set foot in Japan, spoke Japanese only because his parents had insisted on maintaining their heritage. When the war started, he had volunteered immediately, partly from patriotism and partly from a desperate need to prove that his face did not determine his allegiance. Now he found himself at this remote Arizona facility, assigned to translate for women who looked at him with confusion and something that might have been betrayal. How could someone who shared their blood serve the enemy? But Nakano understood something that most Americans did not. These women were not the fanatical soldiers of propaganda posters. They were young, frightened, and completely disoriented by the reality of American captivity. They had expected brutality and found bureaucracy. They had prepared for torture and encountered Geneva Convention protocols. The cognitive dissonance was visible in their faces every day. He began conducting informal English lessons during evening recreation periods. Captain Hartwell had approved the activity, noting that communication would make camp management easier. Nakano set up a small classroom in one of the storage buildings, bringing a chalkboard and chalk he had requisitioned from the main base. The first evening, only 5 women attended, including Masako. By the end of the first week, nearly half the prisoners came regularly. Nakano taught them practical phrases. "Good morning." "Yes, ma'am. I do not understand. Please repeat." But he also taught them words they would need to express more complex ideas. Thirsty, hungry, sook, afraid, homesick. He wrote the English words on the board, then wrote the Japanese translations beside them, bridging the languages that separated captors from captives. Masako proved to be his best student. She had studied English in school and retained more than she initially revealed. Her pronunciation improved rapidly, and she began helping other prisoners with their lessons. She discovered she enjoyed teaching, breaking down complex grammar into simple patterns that others could follow. Private Drummond started attending the lessons, sitting in the back of the room. At first, Masako thought he was there for security purposes. Then she realized he was actually trying to learn Japanese. His attempts at pronunciation were terrible, his accent so thick that basic words became nearly incomprehensible. But he kept trying, writing down phrases in a small notebook similar to the one Masako carried. She found herself amused despite the strangeness of the situation. This American farm boy, who had brought them ice water during the worst heat, was now struggling to learn their language while they learned his. One evening, Drummond tried to say thank you in Japanese. What came out was so mangled that several women actually laughed, a sound that had been absent from the compound for weeks. He grinned sheepishly and tried again. "Arigato," Masako corrected gently. He repeated it closer this time. "Arigato," he said again, this time to her directly. She nodded, acknowledging both the word and the effort behind it. April 23, 1945. The day would be remembered by every woman in the compound, though none of them knew its significance when it began. Morning assembly proceeded as usual, followed by work assignments and the now familiar rhythm of captivity that had become routine over the past 2 months. The afternoon heat had settled over the compound like a heavy blanket when Private Drummond appeared at the mess hall, carrying a wooden crate that clearly required careful handling. He moved with unusual purpose, setting the crate on one of the long tables, while other guards watched with expressions of amusement. Masako was helping prepare the evening meal when she noticed the activity. Through the kitchen doorway, she could see Drummond removing items from the crate: glass dishes, metal spoons, and several large containers that were smoking in the warm air, vapor rising from them like mysterious fog. She had never seen anything produce cold smoke before. Ice, she knew, but these containers seemed to hold something else entirely. Captain Hartwell entered the mess hall with Sergeant Nakano, both wearing expressions that Masako had learned to recognize as anticipation. The captain said something in English, and Nakano translated for the gathered prisoners. "Private Drummond has brought something to share with you. An American tradition. Please, come and sit." The women exchanged uncertain glances, but complied, taking their usual seats at the long tables. Masako sat between Teruko and Hanai, all 3 of them watching as Drummond began opening the containers. What emerged made no sense to their eyes. It was white, but not like rice. Soft, but not like tofu. And it was clearly cold, so cold that it steamed in the warm air. Drummond began scooping the substance into the glass dishes with a metal implement that looked designed specifically for this purpose. He added dark brown liquid from a bottle, then white cream from another container, then placed a bright red sphere on top. The whole creation looked like something from a dream, colorful and impossible. Sergeant Nakano spoke in Japanese. This is called ice cream sundae. The ice cream is frozen cream and sugar. The brown is chocolate sauce. The white is whipped cream. The red is a cherry. It is a dessert, very popular in America. He paused, seeming to search for words to bridge the cultural gap. It is very sweet, very cold. You eat it with a spoon before it melts. Masako stared at the dish placed before her. Frozen cream? Such a thing existed? She looked at Teruko, who appeared equally bewildered. Hanai leaned forward, studying the dessert as if it might provide answers to unspoken questions. Around the table, 43 women faced this strange offering with varying degrees of suspicion and curiosity. Private Drummond picked up his own spoon and took a bite from his own dish, showing them it was safe. Then he gestured for them to try. Masako lifted her spoon with careful precision. The ice cream was harder than she expected, but yielded to pressure. She brought a small amount to her lips. The coldness shocked her first, then the sweetness, then the richness of cream, unlike anything she had tasted. Her eyes widened involuntarily, the mess hall filled with sounds that had never been heard there before. Small gasps of surprise, murmurs of confusion, and from some of the younger women, something that almost approached delight. Masako took another bite of the ice cream sundae, trying to understand what she was experiencing. The cold made her teeth ache, but the sweetness was unlike anything she had encountered. Sugar had been rationed in Japan for years. Desserts had become memories, and nothing in her experience had prepared her for the concept of deliberately frozen cream served as a treat. Teruko ate with methodical precision, analyzing each component separately. She tried the ice cream alone, then the chocolate sauce, then the whipped cream. Her medical training made her approach even food scientifically. This must require significant resources to produce, she observed quietly in Japanese. The refrigeration alone, the sugar, the fresh cream. How much abundance must a country have to freeze desserts for ordinary soldiers? It was a question that hung in the air between them, unanswered but deeply significant. Hane, who had been the most withdrawn since their arrival, took small bites with an expression of wonder that made her look young again. She had stopped crying weeks ago, had stopped showing emotion at all, but the ice cream seemed to bypass whatever walls she had built around herself. Masako watched as tears rolled down the younger woman's cheeks even as she, continued eating. Not tears of sadness exactly, but something more complicated. The tears of someone confronting the gap between what they had been told and what was actually true. Around the room, similar reactions played out. Some women ate quickly, racing against the melting ice cream. Others savored each bite slowly, making the experience last. A few could not finish, overwhelmed by the richness or the emotional complexity of accepting such a gift from their captors. Private Drummond moved through the mess hall, offering seconds to anyone who wanted more. Several women raised their hands hesitantly. He served them with the same careful attention he had shown the first portions, adding extra chocolate sauce when someone pointed to it, extra cherries when another made a gesture requesting them. Masako found herself studying Drummond's face as he worked. He was barely older than she was, probably 21 or 22. His hands were rough from ranch work, his face weathered by sun and wind. But his expression as he served ice cream to enemy prisoners showed none of the hatred she had been taught to expect from Americans. Instead, he looked almost pleased, as if their enjoyment gave him satisfaction. It made no sense, according to everything she had learned about the enemy. That night in the barracks, the women talked long after lights out. The conversation flowed in rapid Japanese, voices kept low but animated in ways they had not been since capture. They were trying to reconcile two contradictory realities: the propaganda that had told them Americans were barbaric demons, and the reality of young men who brought ice water during heat waves and shared frozen desserts that required significant resources to produce. Which version was true? Or were both true somehow? Or had they been lied to about everything? The ice cream sundaes became a weekly tradition, appearing every Tuesday afternoon like clockwork. Private Drummond arranged with the kitchen staff at the main base to have the necessary supplies delivered, using his own ration credits when official channels moved too slowly. Each week he tried different variations: strawberry ice cream instead of vanilla, butterscotch sauce instead of chocolate, nuts sprinkled on top, sliced bananas underneath. The women began anticipating Tuesdays with something that resembled eagerness, though they tried to maintain their disciplined composure. Masako found herself volunteering for kitchen duty more frequently. The work was hot and tedious, but it allowed her to observe how American cooking worked. She had never paid much attention to food preparation before the war. Her family had employed a cook, and then military service had provided meals without requiring her participation. But here in the camp kitchen, she discovered an unexpected interest in the process of transforming raw ingredients into finished dishes. The American cook, a heavy-set woman named Betty Morrison, who was Private Drummond's aunt, welcomed Masako's help with gestures and simple English commands. Stir this, chop that, taste this. Is it good? The language of cooking transcended their linguistic barriers. Betty taught Masako how to make biscuits, a bread unlike anything from Japanese cuisine. The dough required folding and kneading in specific ways. Too much handling made them tough, too little left them dense. But done correctly, they emerged from the oven light and flaky, perfect for soaking up gravy or butter. Masako practiced repeatedly, her military precision translating well to the exacting measurements baking required. When she finally produced a batch that met Betty's standards, the older woman hugged her impulsively. The gesture shocked Masako. Physical affection from the enemy was not something she had prepared for emotionally. Teruko had become indispensable to Dr. William Hayes, the camp physician. Her medical knowledge, combined with her careful attention to hygiene and her gentle manner with patients, made her more than just an assistant. She began teaching him Japanese medical terms while learning English equivalents: headache, fever, nausea, infection. They developed a shorthand communication that allowed them to work efficiently despite the language barrier. When one of the guards developed appendicitis requiring emergency transport to the base hospital, Teruko accompanied them, her assistance during the crisis earning her respect from medical staff who had initially been skeptical. Hanai discovered an unexpected talent with mechanical repairs. The camp's ancient typewriter, used for administrative work, had been malfunctioning for weeks. She studied it carefully, taking it apart with the same methodical precision she had applied to filing systems. Within 2 days, she had identified the problem, a bent lever that needed straightening, and repaired it completely. Captain Hartwell, impressed, began bringing her other broken items: a radio with poor reception, a fan that wobbled, a desk drawer that stuck. Ahane fixed them all, her small hands and patient focus perfect for delicate work. She spoke little during these repairs, but her actions communicated competence that transcended words. The camp's atmosphere had shifted in ways that were difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Guards and prisoners still maintained appropriate distances, but the interactions had warmed. Greetings were exchanged. Small jokes were attempted across language barriers. And every Tuesday afternoon, the mess hall filled with the sweet smell of ice cream and the sound of women laughing. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day brought celebrations across America, but in the Arizona compound, it brought something else: newspapers. Captain Hartwell had previously restricted access to outside news, concerned about maintaining security and preventing the spread of demoralizing information. But with Germany's surrender, she made the decision to allow limited newspaper access in the camp library, a small room where prisoners could spend free time during evening hours. The first papers arrived with photographs that would change everything. Masako sat at one of the reading tables, a copy of the Arizona Republic spread before her. Sergeant Nakano had helped her translate the headlines, though the photographs needed no translation. Cities reduced to rubble: Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, Nagoya. The aerial bombing campaign had been far more devastating than anything they had been told while still in service. The propaganda had assured them that Japan was winning, that American forces were being pushed back, that victory was imminent. These photographs told a different story, one of utter devastation on a scale that seemed impossible. But it was the smaller articles that truly shook her. Reports from Okinawa, where Japanese forces had fought with suicidal determination, ordering civilians to kill themselves rather than face capture. Stories of kamikaze pilots, some barely 18 years old, deliberately crashing planes into American ships. Accounts of soldiers who refused to surrender even when their positions were hopeless, choosing death over the perceived dishonor of capture. Masako read these accounts with growing horror. She had known the military code of honor demanded death before surrender. She had failed to live up to that code by allowing herself to be captured. But reading about what that code had actually meant in practice, the waste of young lives, the pointless deaths, the suffering inflicted on civilians by their own military, she felt something crack inside her carefully maintained composure. Teruko found her there 2 hours later, still sitting at the table with newspapers spread around her. The medical assistant's face showed that she had been reading similar accounts. They looked at each other, and in that look was a shared recognition. They had been serving something they did not understand. They had believed in something that was not what they thought it was. The question that had been forming since their capture finally crystallized into words. What kind of military code demanded that soldiers die rather than survive to see their families again? What kind of honor system valued death over life so absolutely? Hanai entered the library carrying a letter that had arrived through the International Red Cross. Her hands shook as she held the thin paper. The letter was from a neighbor in Hiroshima, not family, because her family was gone. The neighbor wrote carefully, trying to be gentle while delivering devastating news. Hanai's parents had died in an American firebombing raid in March. Her younger brother had been conscripted and was missing, presumed dead in Okinawa. Her grandmother had died of starvation during the winter. Of her immediate family, only Hanai remained, and she remained only because she had been captured, only because she had failed to die with honor as the military code demanded. The Bacha. Revelations continued throughout May as more newspapers arrived and more Red Cross letters filtered through. But it was a particular Life magazine that arrived in mid-May that forced the women to confront the most uncomfortable truths. The magazine contained photographs from liberated concentration camps in Europe, images of skeletal prisoners, mass graves, evidence of systematic murder on an industrial scale. Captain Hartwell hesitated before making these available, but Sergeant Nakano argued that the women deserved to understand the full scope of what the Axis powers had done. Masako studied the photographs with a sinking feeling in her stomach. These were German camps, not Japanese facilities, but the photographs prompted questions she could not ignore. If Germany had committed such atrocities in the name of their cause, what had Japan done in territories they occupied? She remembered hearing rumors during her service, stories about treatment of Chinese civilians that were quickly dismissed as enemy propaganda, reports about prisoner camps in the Philippines that were explained away as necessary security measures. Now she wondered what truth those rumors contained. Sergeant Nakano, sensing the women's confusion and distress, organized a discussion session one evening. He spoke carefully, trying to help them process what they were learning without crushing them completely. "War brings out the worst in humanity," he said in Japanese. "Every country has committed acts they should be ashamed of. But there are degrees of wrong. Understanding what your country did does not mean you personally are responsible for those actions. The question is what you do with that knowledge now." Teruko spoke up, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "We were told we were serving our country's defense. that Americans wanted to destroy our way of life, that we were fighting to protect our families. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But what if we were actually serving something evil? What if our service, however well-intentioned, contributed to suffering we knew nothing about? The question hung heavy in the room. Other women nodded slowly, their faces reflecting the same moral anguish. Masako found herself thinking about the ice cream sundaes. The gesture had seemed strange when it first happened, almost trivial. But now she understood it differently. Private Drummond had not been trying to win their loyalty or manipulate them. He had simply seen people suffering from heat and offered cold refreshment. He had seen prisoners far from home and offered a taste of American normalcy. The kindness was not strategic. It was simply human, and it stood in stark contrast to the military culture she had served, where kindness was seen as weakness and mercy was considered dishonor. That night, Masako wrote in her notebook with new clarity, "I thought I understood honor. I thought dying for your country was the highest virtue. But I have learned something here that contradicts everything I was taught. Perhaps true honor is not about dying well. Perhaps it is about living well, treating others with dignity, choosing mercy when you could choose cruelty. These Americans have shown me a different kind of strength, one that does not require brutality to prove itself." June brought scorching temperatures that made the April heat seem mild by comparison. The compound became nearly unbearable during midday hours, with metal surfaces too hot to touch and the desert sun beating down relentlessly. But despite the physical discomfort, or perhaps because of it, the community within the camp continued to deepen. The women no longer simply endured their captivity. They began to actively participate in the camp's daily life in ways that went beyond required duties. Teruko had effectively become Dr. Hayes's full partner in the medical facility. She now treated minor injuries and illnesses independently, consulting him only for more serious cases. Her confidence had grown along with her English skills. She taught him proper technique for applying traditional Japanese pressure point therapy for headaches, and he taught her about new antibiotics that were revolutionizing battlefield medicine. Their collaboration had become so effective that Dr. Hayes submitted an official commendation, noting that Teruko's assistance had improved care for everyone in the facility. Masako's role had expanded beyond kitchen work and translation. Captain Hartwell began relying on her to help mediate disputes among the prisoners, to explain American customs that confused the women, and to provide insight into how the group was adapting emotionally. Masako found herself in an unexpected position of leadership, not through military rank, but through earned trust. The other women came to her with questions, concerns, and confessions they did not feel comfortable sharing with American staff. One afternoon, Masako helped organize a cultural exchange program. The Japanese women taught to interested guards about tea ceremony, demonstrating the careful precision and mindfulness required. They showed them calligraphy, explaining how each brushstroke carried meaning beyond the words themselves. They sang traditional songs, their voices harmonizing in ways that reminded everyone that beauty could transcend conflict. In return, the American staff taught them about baseball, explaining rules that made no sense until suddenly they did. Private Drummond taught rope techniques used in ranching. Betty Morrison demonstrated how to make apple pie from scratch. Hane's mechanical skills had become legendary in the compound. She had repaired everything from the camp commander's personal typewriter to the temperamental water pump that supplied the facility. Her quiet competence earned respect even from guards who remained skeptical about fraternizing with enemy prisoners. She rarely spoke, but her actions communicated volumes about her character and capabilities. When the camp's only radio stopped working, threatening to cut off their connection to news about the war's progress, Hanae spent 3 days diagnosing and repairing a complex problem with the vacuum tubes. The Tuesday ice cream tradition had evolved into something more elaborate. Now the women helped prepare the desserts, learning to scoop the ice cream properly, to warm the chocolate sauce to the right consistency, to create the perfect swirl of whipped cream. Private Drummond showed them different presentation styles, turning simple desserts into small works of art. The weekly ritual had become a symbol of something larger, the possibility that former enemies could work together toward shared joy rather than mutual destruction. Late June brought news that the war in the Pacific was intensifying. American forces were preparing for what many believed would be an invasion of the Japanese home islands. The newspapers predicted massive casualties on both sides. Radio broadcasts spoke of a final desperate battle that would determine Japan's fate. For the women in the Arizona compound, this news created a strange dissonance. They should want Japan to win, to prove that their sacrifice had meaning, but they had seen enough to know that more fighting meant more death, more destruction, more suffering. Masako found herself sitting in the mess hall one Tuesday afternoon, watching Private Drummond prepare the weekly ice cream sundaes with his characteristic care. He was explaining to one of the younger women how to judge when the ice cream was soft enough to scoop easily, but not so soft that it would melt immediately. His patience was remarkable. He demonstrated the technique 3 times, encouraging her attempts even when they were clumsy. Masako realized she was witnessing something profound disguised as something trivial. The ice cream sundaes were not really about dessert, they were about dignity. Every Tuesday, Private Drummond treated enemy prisoners as if they were guests deserving of consideration and care. He offered them choices, chocolate or butterscotch, extra cherries or extra cream. In a situation where they had no control over anything, where every aspect of their lives was dictated by captivity, these small choices restored a measure of agency. The sundaes represented a worldview fundamentally different from the military culture she had served. Masako thought about the contrast. In the imperial military, deprivation was seen as character building. Soldiers were expected to endure hunger, cold, discomfort without complaint. Suffering was meant to forge superior warriors. Pleasure was weakness. Comfort was something to be transcended through discipline and will. But here was an American military culture that believed well-fed, comfortable soldiers performed better, that believed small pleasures improved morale and effectiveness, that saw no contradiction between being a capable warrior and enjoying ice cream on a hot afternoon. She approached Private Drummond after the other women had received their servings. Her English had improved enough for basic conversation. "Why you do this?" she asked, gesturing to the ice cream supplies. "Every week. Much trouble for you." He looked surprised by the question, as if the answer was obvious. "Because it makes people happy," he said simply. "And there's enough hardship in the world without adding to it when you don't have to." The philosophy embedded in that simple statement struck Masako with unexpected force. There's enough hardship in the world without adding to it. It was the opposite of everything she had been taught about strength and discipline. Yet somehow Private Drummond, with his farm boy simplicity and his Tuesday ice cream ritual, had articulated something profound about what it meant to be truly strong. Strength was not about enduring suffering or inflicting it. Strength was about reducing suffering when you had the power to do so. July brought a batch of Red Cross correspondence that had been delayed for months in the chaos of war. 27 women received letters. 16 received nothing, meaning their families either could not be located or no longer existed to write. Masako was among those who received a letter. The thin paper, creased from its long journey, bore her mother's careful handwriting. She sat in the barracks reading words that had been written 3 months earlier, before her mother knew whether Masako was alive or dead. The letter was brief and carefully worded, aware that military censors would read every line. Her mother wrote that Nagasaki had suffered bombing raids, but their neighborhood remained mostly intact. Her father had been conscripted for civil defense duties despite his age. Her younger sister had been evacuated to the countryside with her school. Food was scarce. Everyone was tired. But they endured. The letter ended with a simple plea: come home safely when you can. Masako folded the letter carefully, relief and guilt washing over her in equal measure. Her family lived. But the letter raised as many questions as it answered. Would Nagasaki remain intact? Would her family survive whatever came next? And most complicated, did she want to return to the Japan described in that letter? A place of scarcity, exhaustion, and endless war. Honey had received no letter. She sat on her cot staring at nothing, her face expressionless. The absence of correspondence was its own terrible answer. No family remained to write to her. She was utterly alone in the world, except for the strange community she had found among fellow prisoners and American captors. Taruko sat beside her, saying nothing, just present. Sometimes presence was all that could be offered. Taruko had received news that her parents in Kobe had survived, but her two brothers, both soldiers, were confirmed dead. One had died in Burma, the other in the Philippines. Her parents' letter was filled with grief, but also with questions about her own treatment. Were the Americans cruel? Did she have enough to eat? Were they torturing prisoners as the propaganda had claimed? Taruko realized that her parents still believed the lies they had been fed. They could not imagine that their daughter was being treated with more dignity in enemy captivity than many civilians experienced in Japan itself. That evening, several women gathered to share their news. Those who had received letters read portions aloud, and those who had received nothing listened, finding vicarious connection to homes they might never see again. The stories painted a consistent picture. Japan was suffering terribly. Cities were being systematically destroyed. Food was desperately scarce. The promised victory seemed increasingly impossible. Yet the propaganda continued to insist that Japan would prevail, that the divine wind would protect them, that surrender was unthinkable. Masako listened to these accounts and felt the final threads of her loyalty to the imperial cause begin to fray. What were they being asked to return to? A homeland that no longer existed except in memory? A country that had lied to them about everything from military success to the treatment they could expect from enemies? Or perhaps more accurately, a Japan that had never been what they thought it was? August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice on the radio announcing Japan's surrender. The words were formal and indirect, speaking of enduring the unendurable and bearing the unbearable, never using the actual word surrender. But the meaning was clear. The war was over. Japan had lost. For the women in the Arizona compound, the announcement brought not celebration, but profound uncertainty. Captain Hartwell gave them 3 days to process the news before calling the assembly where she would announce repatriation procedures. During those 3 days, intense conversations filled the barracks late into the night. Some women felt immediate relief. The war was over. They could go home, find what remained of their families, begin rebuilding their lives. Others felt shame. They had survived while so many had died. They had lived in relative comfort while their countrymen starved. They had been captured instead of dying with honor as military code demanded. But a third group, led by Masako, felt something more complicated. They had spent 6 months discovering that everything they believed was false. They had experienced kindness from enemies and learned about cruelty from their own military. They had found purpose and dignity in captivity that they never experienced in service. The question that dominated their discussions was simple but profound. Where did they belong now? Masako spent hours writing in her notebook, trying to articulate feelings that seemed treasonous even to think. She made lists, reasons to return, family, duty, cultural connection, familiar language, familiar food, reasons to stay, safety, opportunity, freedom from shame, distance, from devastation, the community they had built, the possibility of starting completely new lives without the weight of their past service hanging over them. Taruko approached her on the second night after the surrender announcement. "We have been talking," she said quietly, gesturing to include Hane and 8 other women. "We do not want to return to Japan, not yet. Maybe not ever." Masako looked at her friend with surprise and recognition. She had been wrestling with the same conclusion, but had not dared voice it aloud. What would it mean to refuse repatriation? Would the Americans even allow such a choice? On August 21st, Captain Hartwell called the assembly as promised. She stood before the 43 women with official documents from the War Department. Her expression was compassionate as she began speaking, with Sergeant Nakano translating. Transportation would be arranged within 2 weeks. They would be processed through displaced persons camps in the Pacific before being released to return to their homes or what remained of them. She paused, observing their faces. Then Masako stood slowly, her legs shaking, but her voice steady. "Captain Hartwell, may I speak?" Permission granted. Masako looked at the 10 other women who had agreed to support this unprecedented request. "We have been discussing our situation. Some of us," she paused, choosing words carefully in English, "some of us wish to request permission to remain in the United States. We do not wish to return to Japan at this time." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the guards seemed to stop breathing. Captain Hartwell recovered from her shock first. Her military training took over, allowing her to process this unprecedented situation with professional composure. She asked for clarification. Masako, supported by Teruko's quiet presence beside her, explained as best she could in careful English. They had tried to locate families through the Red Cross. Of the 11 women requesting to stay, only 4 had received any word from home. Hane's entire family was dead. Others faced complete uncertainty. More than that, they had found something in America they feared losing. Masako struggled to articulate concepts that barely made sense even to herself. Here we learn what means to be treated with dignity even as enemies. We seek kindness where we expect cruelty. We have chance to work, to contribute, to become better than we were. She gestured toward Private Drummond, who stood at his usual post looking stunned. "This soldier, he bring ice cream every week, not because he must, because he believe we deserve small happiness. This is not Japan we were told to expect from enemies." One of the older women who had chosen repatriation stood up, her face flushed with anger. "You speak of betraying our country, our emperor, our families who suffer, while we eat ice cream in comfort. You dishonor everyone who died believing you would return and help rebuild." The accusation hung in the air, giving voice to the guilt that all of them carried. Masako felt the weight of those words, but held her ground. "I do not speak of betrayal. I speak of choosing life over death, hope over despair, truth over lies, we were told. Japan does not need us to return and starve. Japan needs us to become examples that former enemies can build something better than war." Captain Hartwell intervened before the argument could escalate. "This is a decision each of you must make individually. There is no dishonor in choosing either path." She looked at Sergeant Nakano, who nodded and continued translating. "Those who wish to return will be processed as planned. Those who wish to explore remaining will need to understand the challenges. You would no longer be prisoners of war, but you would not be citizens. You would need sponsors, employment, housing. The United States government makes no promises about accepting you permanently." The stark reality of what they were requesting began to sink in. They were asking to give up the certainty of repatriation, however grim, for the uncertainty of trying to build lives in a country that had been their enemy. They would be stateless persons with no guarantees, dependent on the goodwill of Americans who might not be as kind as Private Drummond and Captain Hartwell. Private Drummond stepped forward unexpectedly. "Ma'am," he addressed Captain Hartwell, "my family has a ranch. We could sponsor 1 or 2 of them, give them work and housing while they figure things out." Other guards began murmuring similar offers. The women who wanted to stay looked at each other with something that might have been hope. The debate over repatriation consumed the compound for the next week. Captain Hartwell had sent urgent communications to Washington describing the unprecedented situation, while the women themselves wrestled with the most important decision of their lives. The 11 who wished to stay found themselves isolated from many who had chosen to return. Accusations of cowardice and betrayal flew during heated arguments in the barracks. Friendships that had sustained them through captivity fractured under the pressure of diverging choices. Masako found herself defending their decision repeatedly. A woman named Sachiko, who had been her bunkmate for months, confronted her with tears streaming down her face. "How can you abandon Japan when she needs us most? Our country is destroyed. Our people are starving, and you choose to stay here eating American desserts while they suffer?" The words cut deeply because they contained truth. Masako could not deny that staying was easier than returning, but she tried to explain that it was not about ease. It was about being honest that they could not help rebuild something they no longer believed in. Teruko took a different approach with those who questioned their decision. She spoke about practical realities rather than philosophical arguments. What medical supplies do you think exist in Japan right now? What hospitals are still standing? How can I help people heal when there are no resources, no infrastructure, no support? Here I can complete my training. I can become a fully qualified nurse. Perhaps someday I can return to Japan with skills and knowledge that will actually be useful. Her pragmatic reasoning convinced some who had been skeptical. Hanai said little during these debates. When pressed, she stated simply that she had no one to return to and nothing to return for. The bluntness of her situation silenced critics who wanted to argue about duty and honor. It was hard to lecture someone about family obligation when her entire family had been killed by the war they had all served. The women who had chosen to return began their own preparations. They sorted through the few possessions they had accumulated, deciding what could be carried and what must be left behind. Some wrote letters to family members they hoped still lived, trying to explain what had happened to them and when they expected to arrive. Others simply packed in silence, their faces set in expressions of resigned determination. On September 1st, Captain Hartwell received the official response from Washington. The War Department would not prevent any prisoner from choosing immediate repatriation. However, those who wished to remain could be reclassified as displaced persons and would be processed for potential immigration status through normal channels. This meant leaving the compound, finding civilian sponsors, securing employment, and navigating complex bureaucratic procedures with no guarantee of success. The American government would not make it easy, but neither would they make it impossible. When Captain Hartwell announced the decision, she added her own observation. "This is perhaps the hardest choice any of you will ever make. There is courage in returning to help rebuild your country. There is also courage in staying to build a new life from nothing. Do not let anyone tell you that one choice is more honorable than the other. Honor lies in being honest about who you are and what you can contribute." September 15th, 1945. The day of departure. 32 women who had chosen repatriation stood in formation for the last time, their few belongings packed in the same canvas bags they had arrived with 6 months earlier. The 11 who were staying stood separately, watching their friends and sometimes their critics prepare to leave. The atmosphere was heavy with conflicting emotions. Relief, anxiety, guilt, hope, and sorrow all mingled together in the early morning air. Captain Hartwell addressed both groups with words she had carefully prepared. "You came here as enemies. You leave as women who have shown remarkable courage in facing impossible circumstances. Those returning carry the responsibility of rebuilding. Those staying carry the responsibility of proving that redemption and transformation are possible. Both paths require strength." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "I am honored to have served as your commander during this difficult time." The women who were staying lined up to say goodbye to those leaving. Tears flowed freely now, the military discipline that had sustained them finally cracking. Sachiko, who had accused Masako of betrayal just days earlier, embraced her tightly. "I understand why you are staying," she whispered in Japanese. "I do not agree, but I understand. Please do not forget us. Please do not forget Japan." Masako promised she would not, though both of them knew that memory and action were different things. The trucks arrived to transport the departing women to the processing center in San Francisco. As they boarded, Private Drummond approached with wooden crates. Ice cream packed in dry ice, enough for the journey. One last American tradition to carry with them. Some women accepted tearfully, others refused, too proud to accept kindness they would never be able to repay. The trucks pulled away slowly, raising dust clouds that obscured the final wave's goodbye. The 11 remaining women stood in the suddenly empty compound, feeling the weight of their choice settle over them. They were no longer prisoners of war. They were not yet immigrants or citizens. They existed in a strange, liminal space, dependent on the goodwill of people who had no obligation to help them. Captain Hartwell gathered them together that afternoon to discuss practical next steps. The Drummond family would sponsor Masako and Hani, providing housing and work on their ranch. Dr. Hayes had arranged for Teruko to continue her medical training at a hospital in Phoenix with sponsorship from a local church. Other guards and local families had stepped forward to sponsor the remaining 8 women. Within a week, the compound that had been their home for 6 months was empty of Japanese prisoners. Masako found herself at the Drummond Ranch in the White Mountains, a landscape of pine forests and high meadows completely unlike the desert compound. Betty Morrison showed her a small cabin where she and Hanai would live. Private Drummond, now simply Lester in civilian context, explained the ranch work they would help with. Cooking for the ranch hands, maintaining the vegetable garden, learning to preserve food for winter. Simple work, but honest work that came with dignity and fair wages. 25 years later. July 4, 1970, Masako Ishida. Drummond stood in her kitchen in the White Mountains of Arizona, preparing ice cream sundaes for the annual Independence Day celebration her family hosted. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, scooping vanilla ice cream, drizzling chocolate sauce, adding whipped cream and cherries with the precise technique Lester had taught her decades earlier. Through the window, she could see her 3 children playing with cousins and neighbors, their laughter floating on the summer breeze. They were fully American, knowing Japanese only through the phrases she taught them and the stories she shared about a homeland they had never seen. Lester entered the kitchen, his hair now gray, but his smile unchanged from the young soldier who had first offered ice water to frightened prisoners. He wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Thinking about that first Tuesday?" he asked. She nodded. Every Independence Day brought memories of that moment in the compound when everything began to change. When a simple frozen dessert revealed that enemies could choose to be something else. The doorbell rang. Masako opened it to find Teruko and Hanai, both arriving from Phoenix where they lived and worked. Teruko had become chief of nursing at Phoenix General Hospital, respected for her skill and her mentorship of young nurses. Hane had married a mechanical engineer and now taught mathematics at a community college, her gift for understanding systems translating well to abstract equations. They embraced with the comfort of sisters, their bond forged in circumstances none of them could have imagined surviving. They carried their Sundays outside to where picnic tables were laden with food, representing their blended lives. American hamburgers and hot dogs alongside Japanese dishes, Masako had learned to recreate from memory. The gathering included former guards from the compound, now friends who attended each other's children's weddings and celebrated holidays together. Sergeant Nakano, retired from the military and teaching Japanese at the university, raised a glass in a toast to choices that seemed impossible but became gateways to unexpected futures. Later, as fireworks exploded over the mountains in celebration of American independence, Masako thought about the women who had returned to Japan. She still corresponded with several, their letters describing the hard work of rebuilding and the gradual transformation of their homeland into something new. They had chosen the more difficult path in many ways, confronting the devastation directly rather than starting fresh in America. Both groups had found their own forms of redemption. Masako's youngest daughter tugged at her sleeve. "Mama, tell us again about the ice cream story." The children never tired of hearing how their mother's life had been changed by frozen dessert offered by an enemy who chose kindness over cruelty. Masako settled into her chair, her family gathered close, and began the story one more time. It reminded them all that the most profound transformations often begin with the smallest gestures, that choosing mercy over hatred is always possible, that enemies can become family when given the chance, and that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in dying for a cause, but in living fully for a better one.